The forced incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II represents one of the most significant constitutional failures in United States history. Between 1942 and 1945, the federal government removed more than 120,000 individuals of Japanese ancestry from their homes and placed them in confinement camps under military authority. This action was carried out without criminal charges, trials, or individualized assessments of loyalty, despite the fact that the majority of those affected were American citizens by birth. Prior to World War II, Japanese American communities were well established along the West Coast, particularly in California, Oregon, and Washington. These communities were composed of first-generation immigrants known as Issei and their American-born children known as Nisei. Federal law prevented Issei from becoming naturalized citizens, while Nisei were citizens under the 14th Amendment. Despite legal discrimination, Japanese Americans developed successful agricultural enterprises, small businesses, and community institutions. Their economic progress, however, often intensified resentment among white competitors and contributed to long-standing racial hostility. Anti-Japanese sentiment did not originate with Pearl Harbor. For decades, exclusionary laws targeted Asian immigrants, including alien land laws that restricted property ownership and immigration acts that barred further entry. Popular media and political rhetoric frequently portrayed Japanese immigrants as unassimilable and disloyal. These prejudices created a foundation that made mass incarceration politically possible once war began. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, national fear escalated rapidly. Public officials and military leaders framed the event as evidence of a broader internal threat, despite the absence of any documented acts of espionage or sabotage by Japanese Americans. Intelligence agencies, including the FBI and the Office of Naval Intelligence, conducted investigations and concluded that Japanese American communities posed no security risk. These findings were ignored in favor of public pressure and political expediency. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The order authorized the Secretary of War to designate military areas and exclude any persons deemed a threat to national security. Although the language of the order was race-neutral, its implementation was explicitly racialized. Japanese Americans were systematically removed from the West Coast, while German Americans and Italian Americans were largely unaffected. The removal process was administered by the Western Defense Command. Families were instructed to dispose of property and report to designated assembly points with only what they could carry. Many were forced to sell homes, businesses, and farms at extreme financial losses. Others abandoned property entirely. There was no compensation for these losses, nor any mechanism for appeal. Initial confinement occurred in temporary detention facilities known as assembly centers. These facilities were often converted racetracks, fairgrounds, or livestock pavilions. Conditions were unsanitary and overcrowded. Families lived in former horse stalls or hastily constructed barracks with limited access to medical care and sanitation. Armed guards enforced confinement, reinforcing the reality that internees were prisoners rather than evacuees. From the assembly centers, internees were transferred to 10 permanent War Relocation Authority camps located in isolated regions of the United States. These camps were deliberately placed in remote deserts, plains, and swamps to minimize public visibility and reduce escape opportunities. Each camp was surrounded by barbed wire fencing and monitored by armed guards stationed in watchtowers. Living conditions in the camps were harsh and inadequate. Barracks were poorly constructed, offering minimal protection from extreme temperatures. Privacy was virtually non-existent, as entire families were housed in single rooms with thin walls. Communal latrines and showers lacked partitions, undermining personal dignity. Medical facilities were understaffed, and supplies were limited. Despite confinement, the War Relocation Authority encouraged internees to create self-governing structures within the camps. Schools, newspapers, churches, and recreational programs were established. However, these efforts did not alter the fundamental reality of incarceration. Employment opportunities within the camps were restricted, and wages were capped far below prevailing labor standards, regardless of professional qualifications. In 1943, the federal government introduced a loyalty questionnaire intended to assess the allegiance of Japanese American internees. Two questions proved particularly controversial. One asking whether respondents were willing to serve in the U.S. military, and another requiring them to renounce allegiance to the Japanese emperor. These questions failed to account for the legal status of Issei, who were barred from U.S. citizenship and risked statelessness if they renounced Japan. Responses to the questionnaire resulted in further divisions within the camps. Individuals who answered negatively or refused to answer were labeled disloyal and transferred to the Tool Lake Segregation Center, which functioned as a high-security camp. Families were separated and tensions increased. The questionnaire did not accurately measure loyalty, but instead intensified fear and confusion. At the same time, Japanese American men were drafted or volunteered for military service. The 400 Mordiakan Regimental Combat Team, composed almost entirely of Japanese American soldiers, served with distinction in Europe. The unit became one of the most decorated in U.S. military history, highlighting the contradiction between the nation's demand for loyalty and its denial of civil rights. Legal challenges to internment were brought before the federal courts. In Korematsu v. United States, 1944, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of exclusion based on military necessity. Decades later, government records revealed that officials had knowingly suppressed intelligence reports that contradicted claims of military threat. The decision is now widely regarded as a grave judicial failure. As the war drew to a close, the government began dismantling the camp system. Internees were released with minimal assistance, often receiving small cash payments and transportation vouchers. No compensation was provided for lost property or economic damage. Many returned to communities where housing, employment, and social acceptance were unavailable. For years after the war, the internment experience remained largely absent from public discourse. Survivors often avoided discussing their incarceration due to stigma, trauma, or fear of renewed discrimination. Educational materials minimized or omitted the camps entirely, framing them as wartime necessities rather than constitutional violations. In the 1980s, renewed public scrutiny led to the establishment of the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. The Commission concluded that the incarceration was not justified by military necessity and resulted from racial prejudice, war hysteria, and failures of political leadership. These findings directly challenged the original justification for internment. In 1988, the Civil Liberties Act was signed into law, issuing a formal apology and financial compensation to surviving internees. While the act acknowledged wrongdoing, it could not fully address the long-term consequences of incarceration, including intergenerational trauma and economic loss. The internment of Japanese Americans demonstrates how constitutional protections can be suspended under the pressure of fear and racial bias. It underscores the dangers of allowing executive authority to override individual rights without evidence or accountability. This history remains a critical case study in civil liberties, national security, and the responsibilities of democratic governance.